Hello, everybody. We'll just wait for a few more people to come in and then we'll get started. Okay, I think we'll get started. Good morning and warm welcome to today's panel discussion webinar, Caring for the Grey in LGBTQ. Thank you so much for coming. I hope you find the discussion interesting and inspiring. My name's Liz Wansmurray and I'm a researcher at the University of York. I've recently almost completed my PhD looking at the inclusivity of community-based social care for older LGBTQ+ people. And the theme for LGBT History Month seemed like a fantastic opportunity to bring together those who have dedicated their work and research to ensuring that care and support for older LGBTQ people is inclusive and cognizant of the needs of this particular group. So just a few practical bits. Feel free to enable captions via the captions button on the bar running across the bottom of your screen. You should have a Q&A function, which is how you'll be able to communicate with our panelists today. You can also upvote other questions, and also to say this is a safe space and we would encourage everyone to treat each other with dignity and respect in the Q&A. Attendees are muted, so please do use the Q&A function to communicate with the panelists. If you have any further questions or your question doesn't get asked at the end of the session today, then please feel free to email me. My email address is here. I will put it up on the end of the screen, and we will actually be sending out an email with a recording and lots of links of interesting and useful resources for you after the session as well, and my email address will be included in that. The event is going to be recorded and published online, but no attendees will be visible on the recording. So I just wanted to give a little bit of background and context before we start our conversation about the current generation of older LGBTQ+ people who face a lifetime of discrimination, fighting for equal rights and living through historic and ongoing inequalities and criminalisation of sexual identity in their younger lives. As the community ages, needing support becomes more of an issue, particularly when considering the higher likelihood of living alone, having less social capital, and enduring the cumulative effects of lifelong discrimination. Supporting older LGBTQ+ people in inclusive ways is extremely important and can often be challenging for providers of support to deliver within a framework of often underfunded, understaffed, and sometimes undertrained social care workforce and provision. The key minority stress theory suggests that members of marginalised groups face additional stressors through the cumulative impact of ongoing discrimination. This can have physical and mental impacts, leading to depression, self-harm, drug and alcohol misuse, and a range of other impacts. Socially, LGBTQ people are less likely to be married or partnered, less likely to have family of origin support, are more likely to live alone, and are less likely to have children, which results in lower levels of social support. A Stonewall survey identified that 3 in 5 were not confident about social services understanding or meeting their needs. 72% identified needing care as their biggest concern about aging. 48% felt that their sexual identity had or would have a negative effect on them as they aged. And 65% anticipated hiding their sexuality in residential care. Today, we're going to talk about key factors and some of the ways we can more inclusively and effectively support older LGBTQ people within social care. Hopefully, this is what you were expecting and what you're here for today. So, just to do a little bit of an introduction to our fabulous panel today. Professor Trish Hufford-Letchfield, she/her, from the University of Strathclyde, is a qualified nurse and social worker with 18 years practice experience in social work, the latter 10 managing statutory social work services. Her research interests lie in the experiences of ageing in marginalised community, and most of her research is applied and co-produced with people with lived experience. Her doctorate studies were in educational gerontology, exploring the role of lifelong learning in care services. She has a strong interest in the rights of LGBTQ+ communities and is a founder member of the International LGBTQI Social Work Network and the leading academic in the development of the new Skills for Care LGBTQ learning framework. Trish has over 130 publications, including 19 key books covering a range of topics on leadership, management, organisational development, feminism, sexual and gender identities, values and ethics, gerontology and social work supervision. Professor Ben Thomas, he, him, is a professor of mental health and learning disabilities at London's South Bank University, where he is co-lead of the NIHR Integrated Clinical Academic Postdoctoral Bridging Scheme, rolls off the tongue. He works as the research and policy coordinator for the charity Opening Doors UK, which provides support and services for older LGBTQ+ people, as well as the Pride in Care quality standard, which includes specialist training for statutory and voluntary organisations such as care homes, housing associations and hospitals. Ben's research interests include addressing health inequalities and improving the mental health of minority and disadvantaged groups. He is co-investigator for an ESRC-funded project examining the intersectional perspectives for community inclusion of older, marginalised people with learning disabilities and ageing LGBTQ+ people. Ben has worked in a variety of different settings in the UK and Australia, including NHS England, as the advisor for patient safety and mental health. Dr. Jolie Keeming, she, her, is a research fellow working at the Centre for Health Services Studies at the University of Kent. She's a developmental psychologist by background and has extensive experience conducting research with marginalised groups. Her main research interest is inclusive practice within social care in relation to a range of protected characteristics, including sexuality, gender identity, disability, age, and ethnicity. Jolie currently leads on the Circle project, creating inclusive residential care for LGBTQ+ elders, in which she examines how residential care providers can be supported to improve their LGBTQ+ inclusive care provision. As part of this project, she is co-producing a resource for care homes to support LGBTQ+ practice. In another project Jolie led on, she investigated how care commissioners can promote LGBTQ+ inclusive practice in care capacity in social care. Dr. Darman Jayasingam, he, him, is a lecturer in social work at the University of Manchester and has worked in social work education and research for 20 years. His research and teaching relate to race, sexuality, power and inequalities in social work and social care, lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans and queer people's experience of using social care services, and the impacts of digital technology on social workers' communication and relationships. A huge thank you to all of you for giving up the time today to join today's conversation. So we'll get started on our questions. The way this is going to work is I'm going to ask some questions. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And then our panel are going to give us their wisdom and insight about these particular things. As I said, if you have any questions as we're going through, please add them into the Q&A, and we'll have about half an hour at the end of the session to go through the questions that you have. Okay, so I'm going to start with quite a big one. What do you think are the key issues for older LGBTQ+ people, particularly when needing social care or support? Hand over to you. Don't forget to unmute.
There's always one, isn't there? To start off with that, got that one out the way. I mean, I just wanted to say, actually, it's the same as everyone else, you know, in that with their peer group, the rest of the LGBTQI population, they want to be treated with dignity, respect, feel safe in care, feel valued, have their support networks recognised and, you know, involved. And I think that again, when you start looking and unpicking that, that's where the issues then sometimes arise. So I'm just going to plant that one there and let other colleagues respond to that.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree with Trish. I think it's really important that everybody is treated as an individual, and we've all got our own needs. But I would just say that there is an additional problem with older people who are LGBTQ, and that is they are often invisible. So when they do require social care, we're not at the stage yet where social workers actually acknowledge that people might be LGBTQ and realize what the implications of that would be for people. So unfortunately, I think we're still at the stage where people use a heterosexual lens to, when they approach the people in front of them. And that's something that we really need to change.
Okay. So my next question is, I guess following on from this quite nicely, really, are there different considerations for this generation of older LGBTQ+ people specifically in comparison to those who are younger? I guess I touched on this a little bit when I talked about the fact that this generation will have had different experiences from the younger generation. So are there different things that we need to be thinking about for this group?
I think there is, yes. Like without disregarding experiences of younger LGBTQ+ people, I think it's very important to set the experiences of older LGBTQ+ people in a historical context and realize that they have often lived through decades of discrimination. If we look at the UK, there is things like Section 28, the Armed Forces Policy, the societal response to the HIV endemic, decriminalization of homosexuality in the late 60s, but only the age of consent was put equal with heterosexual people, I think 40 years later. So that historical context, I think, is very important to take into account when thinking about key issues for older LGBTQ+ people. And those discriminatory experiences can really lead to a lack of trust in public services when they engage with care services.
Yeah, I mean, I'd agree with everything that's been said. I suppose the key thing to emphasize is that some of that institutional oppression has been from health and social care services, and so people are often quite rightly suspicious about social care services before they use them. If they've used them before, they might have had to be in the closet when they've done so. They'll have experienced being treated as if they are heterosexual and cisgender. So that's colouring everybody's experience of social care when they use it in older life as well.
Yeah. I mean, I just want to say that this is not, these issues are still around, these historical issues. So, in research, things come up such as, people going to their GP. They go to their GP with, mental health problems or health problems, and then it's attributed to their sexual identity or their gender identity. So it's kind of reinforcing kind of these institutional pathologizing of people's identities. But at the same time, their experiences of being invisible or unacknowledged are important to their mental health. So I think it's really important the way in which people are approached, the way in which people are enabled to talk about the things that are affecting them at their time, which might be their diabetes. I had another example of somebody who was put on increasing medication for their mental health as a gay man. But actually they had diabetes and nobody diagnosed that because they just pathologized the issues. And more recently, in talking with care providers, I came across an example of an older trans person who had a lobotomy, for their gender identity. These issues are very much alive. And I think it's really important to take that life course lens to really look at some people would have been, they'll be in your face, they'll be actually activists. They'll have really had an influence on how politics and society are respecting human rights. So not everybody's got the same experience. And I think that life course, that narrative of the person's experience is really important to discover.
I think it's really interesting as well, just coming back to what you were saying, Diamond, about the sort of systemic oppression. I know one of the things that was found in the Women Inequalities report that was produced in 2019 was that a lot of health providers particularly felt that they were meeting somebody's sexual identity needs through referring them to sexual health services. So making this constant conflation between sexual identity and sexual health, and obviously those two things are quite different and quite separate. And I think that there is a misnomer within the system that if we're recognising that, for example, it's a good idea to talk to somebody such as a gay man about the risks of AIDS and HIV, that then we're meeting their needs in terms of their sexual identity. And like you say, Trish, it's much more for people about recognition of their identity as a whole, who they are as a person, how that part of their identity, you know, it kind of feeds into everything else that they do. And I think we have historically kind of separated those two things. So yeah, it's an interesting challenge, isn't it, as to how we actually move services on to really recognizing that if you don't kind of properly recognize somebody's identity, that has an impact on their mental health, that can have an impact on their confidence, their ability to advocate for themselves, their ability to ask for help when they need it. So it has a range of impacts, doesn't it?
Yeah, and I think the other thing is, you know, we're all very aware of ageism in society. So people are going to experience ageism, even within the community experiencing ageism. And during COVID, you know, the research that took place during COVID, I mean, when you think about the general media response around the support of older people, what happened during COVID, all the ageist response, you know, you can look at LGBT older people. No one talked about them. They had, you know, they were making their own care arrangements. All of a sudden, those care arrangements were suspended and there was no alternative for them. But on the positive side, I think it's really important also to think about older people that they've had a lifetime of experiences, good and bad, and there's a lot of capacity there, and we need to really think about, you know, supporting that capacity building. And like, for example, the research we did during COVID about their experiences, they really supported each other. They really knew what the issues would be. And there were I learned a lot about LGBTQI older people's care practices, the love, the outreach, the support, the capacity, the understanding is there. And we really need to delve in and support that, you know, capacity building for later life. We can learn a lot about aging through the lens of LGBTQI older people.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. So my next question. The LGBTQ+ community are a diverse and varied group. How do we make sure we don't end up treating everyone the same way? It's a controversial one.
I think it's a very important question, because I think, like, obviously it's about sexuality and gender identity, and I think often people think they're the same or they're confused about what the difference is. So I think it's important to create awareness around the difference. I mean, personally speaking, I think there's a lot of strength from having that acronym together and sort of supporting each other. But I think in relation to care needs, it's very important that there's adequate training around the difference between sexuality and gender and specific needs that may bring, but also the awareness of intersectionality, so that you can have both a marginalized sexuality and gender identity, and that may mean additional stresses. So how we make sure we don't end up treating everyone the same is, I mean, for a lot of these questions, the answer is adequate training, but I think also in the work we do to have a really strong focus on making sure that we include diverse populations. So if we do co-production, co-design work, which I think a lot of us are involved in, that we really pay attention to, that we don't just include white gay men, for example. Yeah.
No, no offense to the white gay men
No,
here.
no offense to the white gay men.
No offense taken. Can I just add a bit there? I think because Jolie's absolutely right in terms of it's very difficult conducting research when you are looking at the LGBT community, because the majority of people who, if especially surveys, will be gay white men, and that's great that they do, but it is then, you know, you always have to go that extra mile to find other members, I suppose, or other groups. Opening Doors, I'm not sure if everybody knows what Opening Doors does, but it provides services and support for LGBTQ+ people over 50. And I think one of the things that I've learned in the 5 years that I've been there is the age span between 50 and we've got members who are in their 90s is considerable, really. And often we don't consider that, you know, we lump everybody together, not just because of their gender identity, but because of age as well, really. You know, once you hit a certain age, it's like you go into a certain ward, or, you know, you go into that elderly care ward or whatever. And, and it's really taught me how different people are. And in trying to provide services for people, when we sort of do the member survey, what comes up all the time is the younger age group, of course, most of them are working, and therefore do not want events or meetings or anything held in the afternoon. Whereas older people don't like going out in the evening, don't like going out in the dark. So they want those things in the daytime, you know. And then it's quite interesting because often lesbian want their own particular event or film night or whatever it is. And we had to set up a special group for trans people. So I think, you know, the diversity there is rich, incredibly rich. And as Jolie said, I think there's strength having it all together, but there are fractions, you know. I've heard gay men say, for example, I don't understand this trans thing. I don't feel as if I've got anything, you know, aligned or in common with them. And which I find astounding, because I just think, like, well, you know, where's your support? Where's your comradeship? Where's your solidarity, really? And I think a lot, you know, the LGBTQ movement was built on that solidarity, and that has to continue. And if we can't support each other, then I think we've got a problem on our hands, basically.
I think it's really interesting. I know when I was recruiting for my own research, that I had some conversations about whether I included the Q, the T, you know, all of the different kind of identities. And actually, one of my thoughts was, I don't want to give the impression that I'm going to be looking at something that's trans specific, because that isn't the focus of the research. But actually, from my perspective, that sells that short, because it's a very important separate area of consideration. There's different things that we need to think about to be able to support that group specifically and effectively. And it's difficult, because you want to kind of, like you say, be part of, you know, making sure that that is a solid group that is supporting each other. But we have to acknowledge that there are going to be, particularly when it comes to social care, different sets of needs that need to be catered to, different sets of experiences that will need to be catered to. You know, for older trans people, you know, they will have had a real kind of, you know, roller coaster over the last sort of 40, 50 years of, you know, of support more generally in the population, and you know, and that has an impact on them, and then how we can support them effectively. So I think it's a really key issue, and I don't think one that we can find a solution for, unfortunately. We need to, you know, keep thinking about how we look at both intersectionality, but also recognise the individuality within those groups. Darren?
Yeah, I mean, I think those points are all really important, aren't they, about the diversity amongst the LGBT communities, in terms of gender identity and sexuality, but also in terms of ethnicity. And that's the issue that I think came out of the scoping review that we did of older ethnic minority LGBTQ people's social care needs, is that so often the minimal research that's been done shows that when ethnic minority people use health and social care services, they're assumed to be heterosexual, despite often very clear evidence that they're not, because of this very crude frame of culture. I'm not suggesting that cultural competence is always crude, but often when it's applied in a crude way. So there's an assumption that if you're British Pakistani, then of course you will be, you'll have a conventional heterosexual lifestyle. So it's interesting what becomes invisible and who can't possibly be part of the LGBTQ rainbow, if you like. So I suppose there's a problem, isn't there, with the frames that we have available to us to understand diversity, because they have their limitations and they have their exclusions. And I suppose the other thing that came out of that scoping review, just quickly, is that there's a shift in research towards using these very generic acronyms. LGBTQ or LGBT are really prevalent now in a way that they weren't 20 years ago in research. And so until recently is BME and BAME. So we have less clarity from the research data now than we might have done even in the 1990s, because less specific research is being done.
Yeah, it's definitely an issue. Trish?
You know, I just wanted to say, you know, there's I think given the government's take on immigration, and you know, I know that in Scotland there was a representation around LGBTQI migrants not being, you know, to be excluded from that transfer to Rwanda. Can you imagine, you know, for LGBTQI migrants who, even when you know, within their own communities here, it's not not safe for them. I know that during COVID in Glasgow there were some suicides amongst the LGBTQI population, you know, because they were put into hotels, presumably with their own, you know, like group, and that was a very dangerous situation for them. So, and again, I think, you know, there's issues around going back to that life course. If you think about trans older people, that trajectory of poverty, you know, where they've not had access to, they've been unemployed, or you know, being kicked out of their jobs, kicked out of their homes and families, the homelessness, the cumulative poverty for later life for some particular groups because of what's happened to them. I think, you know, that poverty, homelessness and housing quality, those kinds of issues are another way of the, you know, looking at the intersectionality of how older people are, the resources that they have in later life to, you know, for their well-being.
Yeah, I mean, I think that they're all very, very valid points. Just to, I guess, switch it up a little bit, my next question is a little bit more on the positive side. So what does good practice look like, and how do we know if things are actually improving? I'm going to nobble one of you.
Well, I'm happy to go. So, okay, the first question, what does good practice look like? I think what I often hear, so I mostly work with residential care providers for now, but I'm also moving into home care, is that a lot of people have a strong willingness to be inclusive, but they just don't have the skills or the knowledge. And a sentence I often hear is, we treat everyone the same. And I think that links back to things that have been said before. So I think good practice is around realizing that treating everyone the same means treating people through a heteronormative cisgendered lens, and that LGBTQ+ inclusion is part of personalized care, and treating people as an individual. Some like small examples of things I've seen in my own work working with residential care providers is like very practical things in terms of good practice are using inclusive language, making sure that pronouns are included in email signatures, but also when people move into a care setting, that they are asked about pronouns, or that they are asked about which people are important in your life, rather than just assuming a female presenting person will have a husband or have had a husband, and vice versa. So it's about sort of reducing assumptions but also things like explicit mention of LGBTQ plus inclusion, especially because of that historical context of discrimination. When working with older LGBTQ plus people, they've often told me they need it to be made explicit that the service they are going to is LGBTQ plus inclusive, and that could be, for example, through links through Pride in Care, the program that Opening Doors provides, by mentioning that they have engaged with the framework that Trish led on, but also just imagery on websites. And I often compare it to, I got married last year, and I married a woman. And when I was looking for wedding venues, I only wanted to view the venues that on their websites and social media had imagery of same-sex or non-heterosexual cisgendered couples. And I think that's something that care settings can also incorporate.
I think it was a really interesting finding of my research that although people felt that things like imagery on websites, etc., was tokenistic, that they still used that as a marker. They still sought those things out or felt more comfortable if they could see. And some people talked about how they felt actually if an organisation had gone to that effort already, that indicated that it was something that they were thinking about and looking at. So they might not be there yet, but like you say, that there was that willingness to actually engage. So I think it's very important.
Yeah.
I don't think the problem is, from an academic perspective, I don't think we're there yet in terms of, I know Jolie's study will be demonstrating this, I hope. But, you know, when we evaluate training, we don't normally evaluate it to the extent of the impact it has on the people receiving the care. I mean, training in either social care or healthcare, I suppose. And that's a very difficult thing to do, I know. But until we do that, then, you know, we're just depending on people's, you know, self-administered questionnaires in terms of how they rate their attitudes or knowledge or whatever. And so it would be great, I think, to do a study, you know, building on Jolie's work, where we actually look at what impact are we now having introduced this training and all these other things, you know, because we know it probably does make a real difference, particularly things like having imagery. I mean, I cannot believe in this country magazines are allowed to not, you know, do not have images of gay couples or LGBTQ couples or LGBTQ people even, you know. It's all, especially older, anything targeting older people, is always white, heterosexual couple, normally drinking a glass of champagne on a cruise liner somewhere. I'm sure lots of people like that sort of thing. I couldn't think of anything more horrid, but there you go. But that's, you know, that's the image that's portrayed about this is how we should live when we retire or whatever, you know. And I think it's just so false, you know. It just misses the whole diversity of you know, of the people who live in this country. And yeah, so I think we need, that's where we need to get to, so that we can really demonstrate that doing this, you know, has this outcome really. Yeah.
I mean, I think, what does good look like? What do we expect? Do we say what the expectations are? You know, I mean, well done to Brighton and Hove recently, the commissioners there and the council there who actually specified the outcomes they want in the contracts that they did with 84 organisations, who will go on to do that in domiciliary care services. You know, in your course of your contract, you will demonstrate X and show us the evidence. The other thing is that we want, you know, we've got lots and lots of learning resources that are all about, you know, the challenges for LGBTQI older people, but we want good news stories. We want to say this was my experience. It was really positive. So I think there's something, it's, you know, we always look at the end result, but it's something about raising expectations, being clear about what an older person, what can they expect of a service. We have that very clearly outlined in, you know, some of the what CQC do and that sort of thing. But we need to really think about, you know, when we're recruiting, inducting people, this is what we expect. This is what, you know, what LGBT older people expect from the service. And, you know, when we recruit you into this organisation, you need to be aware of this is also an area that you should be thinking about. Let's talk LGBTQI and every day.
I think it's a real issue, isn't it? Organisations not necessarily having the drivers or even the knowledge that they need to understand some of these things. So, like you say, the move that Brighton and Hove has made is a massive thing, because it just embeds that you know, in the culture, and that's kind of what you need to do, really. Is that embedding in the culture, isn't it? Yeah. Any other, before we move on to our next question, which is about training, any other points about good practice?
Yes, sorry, I just want to mention some work that we did looking at the Joint Strategic Needs Assessment in London, you know, where there is, as we know, there is a very high LGBTQ population. But I was just surprised, you know, by the lack of any mention of LGBTQ people in any of those strategic plans, basically, by the local authorities. It was astounding, really. Thankfully, lots of them have picked up on it, and so now I am regularly invited to attend meetings. You know, now that they're planning the next JSNAs, Joint Strategic Needs Assessment. But you know, and yet there are loads of really good examples, as you say, around the country.
Same for the government survey, you know, and the action plan. It doesn't have a big focus on older people.
No.
I think that also comes, sorry.
No, go on, Julie.
No, I think that also comes back to what you mentioned before, Trish, around like ageism. I think in general, and I mean, it's interesting for me always because I'm not British, so I'm from the Netherlands, where I think, I'm not saying everything's perfect there, but there's a slightly like more open culture in terms of talking about sexuality. And I think the combination of ageism and sort of the discrimination for sexuality and gender identity is quite strong, because people find it hard to accept that an older person can have a sexuality, let alone if that sexuality is not heterosexual. So that sort of non-consideration of older LGBTQ plus people is also because of that whole thought process of they don't exist. Older people don't have a sexuality, and if they do, it's heterosexual. It's definitely not anything else. And I think that is very pervasive, sort of. Yeah.
Darman, did you want to come in there?
Yeah, just a quick point. I mean, that made me think that really the LGBTQI positive practice is good for everybody, isn't it? Because it enables us to talk about sexuality and desire, which is very difficult in a lot of social care services for older people. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so my next question, we've kind of touched on this a little bit, but I'm going to ask it anyway because I think there's other things that we can talk about. So training for the social care workforce can be inconsistent. What are some of the key ways that we can ensure the importance of culturally competent care for this group is understood by that workforce?
Well, of course, I'm going to mention the framework. Yeah, thank you very much. So I don't know if participants in this webinar are aware that Skills for Care, at long last, everyone always says, well, why isn't it mandatory that we do this training? Well, it still isn't mandatory, but I think Skills for Care is an organisation that sets out standards and, you know, the framework for training in the social care workforce, have commissioned this framework, and which is freely available on their website, which really identifies all the key topics, areas and resources that an organisation can use to know where to start. Because I think organisations, as you said, Jolie, they're very willing. Ben, you said they're very willing, but they don't know where to start. What do we need to do? I don't understand it. Why? What's different about dementia? What's different about end of life care? What do I need to do? And I think, like, we know there's not a lot of resources for training. We know that, you know, a lot of social workers, I work in social work education, Darman does, you know, social workers will spend very little time on LGBT issues in their curriculum. We know there's, you know, issues there. And I think that what the framework offers is, yeah, you can do, we're all responsible for our own learning as well as, you know, we need to find those organisations, look on their websites, use the resources that they're you know, providing, bit of self-learning, equip myself. Am I up to date? Do I really understand? We can maybe get a team discussion. We can talk about it to our managers or supervisors. We can make sure it's in induction. And then, you know, we can make sure that if we're doing dementia or end-of-life care training, are we addressing LGBTQI? And I'm just going to say one more thing, because otherwise I'll hog all the space. But I had a lovely example recently of trainer of a large care provider who does training on medication management. So what's that got to do with LGBTQI? Well, what they did was, in their case scenario, they said, which is a married couple and, you know, dealing with medication at home, they actually said the married couple were two women. And then everyone's like, they're a married couple. Oh, Muriel and Jolie, you know, and it's just about, you know, that mindset, you know, of think LGBT. So I think there's lots of opportunities to integrate it, do particular targeted training, but at all levels, it's about that being curious, having interest, and taking responsibility for our own learning.
I think you make a really interesting point as well, because I think a lot of the research shows that actually being able to sit and have a discussion, talk about it, ask questions is a really, really key way that people can enhance their learning and understanding. And I think I've used this example before, so some of you will have already heard it, but I know I had somebody that took part in my research that delivered training, who talked about somebody that came along that was in their 50s and asked what a lesbian was. So I think we also make these assumptions that people have a baseline of knowledge that they don't necessarily have. So it's how we create those safe spaces, isn't it, to be able to ask those questions, to build that understanding, rather than just kind of saying, these are the things that you need to know, and these are facts that you can kind of, you know, take away as cold hard facts that mean that then you need to behave in a particular way. That it's actually much more nuanced than that, I think. Sorry, Jolie, did I cut in? Were you gonna?
Oh, don't apologize. Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on the question about how we can ensure consistent training. And I feel like what I've learned through my work is that the connections to local government are really important. And the example that Trish gave from Brighton and Hove, that's a local authority I work with as well. I think those connections with local government are so vital, because they have contracts with their care providers. I know there's also private care, but in their contracts, they have the ability to set standards that people have to be held accountable to. And in the study I did with commissioners, we also interviewed care providers, and they actually indicated they want to be held accountable. They want to know what good practice looks like. So if we have those connections with local government, they can set those standards, which I think can help with consistency across training. But also, I mean, it's my sort of ultimate goal to have more of a clear standard in the CQC framework about LGBTQ+ inclusion. And the Circle study that I lead on recently hosted the CQC in a community of practice meeting, and we're definitely not there yet. But I'm hoping that through all the work that we're doing together and sort of keep building on the evidence how important this is, that there will be more consideration within CQC assessments, because there was a recent report from Compassion in Care about LGBTQ+ abuse in care homes, and 99% of those homes had a good or outstanding rating. And I think if we can have that accountability and standard system the same across the board, then that can help with consistency in training and practice.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to ask one more question, and then I think we're going to move into we've got lots in the Q&A, so Chris is just beavering away for me, working out what questions have come, and I have also received a couple by email as well, so I'll bring those in. But I think this is a good one to kind of end this portion of the discussion on. So what are some of the simple actions that services can take to improve the inclusivity of their provision, specifically for older LGBTQ people? Are there, we talked a little bit about things on the website, and, are there other things? So if we've got practitioners in the audience here, we've got people who run services, are there things that they can take away from this conversation today, take back to their services to think about how they start to improve that inclusivity?
I'll start, if I may. I think the main thing for me is for people to have an open mind. When you're assessing somebody, or when you are looking at somebody, don't assume anything about them, really. You have to engage people, and we've already, well, other people have said it, but we already mentioned using the correct pronouns and asking people how they prefer to be, how do they prefer to be addressed, sort of thing. These are really simple things. It reminds me of in the health service, we had to introduce a badge which says, "Hello, my name is," sort of thing, because nurses, not just nurses, but other professions, were actually going up to people, asking them very intimate questions and not even introducing themselves. I mean, and I was thinking, God, have we got to that stage, really, that our level of interaction, like we've taken the personnel out of it, sort of, somehow. So I think I would say the most important thing is when you have got somebody in front of you, keep an open mind. That person could be anything. That person could have any sort of history. You don't know, and so before you start thinking about asking them those questions, just bear that in mind. And don't always look at things through a white heterosexual lens, I guess.
I think to add, and I'm just going to do a bit of promotion, but so in terms of very practical tips for if there are providers in the room, is definitely look at Trish Framework, look at the website of Pride in Care, so Opening Doors, the program they offer in terms of LGBTQ+ inclusion organizations. My study has a quarterly community of practice that's online, that's free, and we during those meetings we touch upon a different topic within LGBTQ+ inclusion in care each session, and we try to make it interactive and really reflect on how people can use that within their own practice. I think that there's a link to the page at the end or something, or Liz will send it out.
It will be sent out.
Yeah, so that might be a helpful thing, because I think the community of practice is really trying to establish ongoing learning, because we're aware that you can't teach everyone everything there is to know about LGBTQ+ inclusion. Like, everyone has that ongoing learning, and that community of practice tries to facilitate that. So yeah, I think and Trish's framework has this fantastic sort of library with all the different resources out there. So there is so much, and it's just about knowing where to find it and how to use it, I think.
Simon?
Those are all really important, aren't they? There's lots of simple things that people can do, but I just wanted to mention, because we've had two very positive questions, is that one of the reasons why things go wrong in social care is because of underfunding and the precarity of the workforce. So that does determine to some extent who works, but it also determines how good people end up doing bad things. It's about being overburdened, isn't it? That applies to social work as well as to other areas of social care.
Trish?
And I think it's really important. I mean, these are all nice and good, positive things to do, but at the end of the day, discrimination is, it's against the law, and it goes against everything we stand for in health and social care. So I think there's something for me about really these small microaggressions, these offhand comments about really taking responsibility of practicing how to say, oh, where did you get that information from? Can be quite a powerful thing to say without offending people, and using the community's own sources to get correct information. You know, I'm all talking about trans, going to the rights. Where did you get your information from? You get it from the trans community, and they are in touch with the everyday experiences and record, you know, taking discrimination seriously, nipping it in the bud, providing opportunities for people to give feedback, taking it seriously and following it up. I think, you know, these are really, really important cultural changes. I know that when I did a project with a work with a large provider on care homes, one of the best outcomes I saw from that project was that a gay man reported to his manager that he'd been harassed by staff over a number of years. And not only that, the manager dealt with it properly, using proper HR procedures and thinking about training for staff. These are the real things that we need to take seriously.
I think that leads me really nicely into this first question from the audience. So this says, I wonder if the panelists could speak to whether there are additional and or different challenges considering the increasingly hostile landscape for trans people, or has this always been a major issue?
I think it's, in my experience with care, or maybe people in general, just a sort of sense I get is that a lot of people are sort of like, okay, we're okay with the gay thing now, but we get that, but now we also need to talk about gender. So I definitely think there is an additional challenge there. There's a huge amount of people experiencing transphobia, abuse, whether that's microaggressions or full-blown abuse. And I think it's a very important area to make people aware of and to highlight. So in that sense, not lump it all together in the umbrella term, but really highlight the specific abuse that trans people have to deal with. And as Trish said, engage with trans people, engage. There's so many good local organizations, and get your information from the people with lived experience.
And I might mention there is a trans practitioners group going to be launched in the UK later on this year. So look out for that, because I think doing evaluation of how people are using a skills care framework, I became very aware there's a lot of trans practitioners, people working in social care. I thought that was very interesting. So, you know, networks that people can belong to, signposting people to networks is very important. And it's, you know, it's about trans rights as well, being very clear on the basis of what you know about trans rights, making sure that that is your baseline. And, you know, I think we shouldn't be afraid of having the discussions. It's very, you know, it's scary to talk about these issues. You might feel, oh, I don't understand. But I think, you know, we don't want to shut these discussions down, but we want to have, you know, we want to encourage people to ask questions, particularly in care services. There's a lot of workers there haven't had opportunity to learn about trans rights. You know, we need to encourage the discussions and be respectful and put boundaries around these, which are, it's about law and trans rights.
If I can just say something positive that's occurred, and this has only occurred over the last 5 years, I would say, but Jodie's mentioned Pride in Care, and one of the things that Pride in Care does is actually examine organizational policies. And so we ask the organization for 10 policies, and then we look at how inclusive they are, basically. And when I started working there, I said I would like to see people's transitioning at work policy. And hardly any of the organizations had transition at work policies. And now I'm really pleased to say most of them do. I know they're skewed because, you know, these are people coming forward to do the Pride in Care, so they know they want to improve inclusivity. so they, in a way, it's a skewed, sample really, but it has really changed. It's become much more common now for organizations to have a transitioning at work policy, and I have to say they are of a good quality. Having looked at lots of them, so I think people have taken that on board. And I know there's a thing about policies, and you get an eye really. So I always know when a policy's been written, because it's a legal requirement. There's a very different tone about that sort of policy to a policy that's been written because the organization genuinely believes in it. It just comes through basically. So I just thought I wanted to throw that in because, some things are improving, and that might not be in the general population, but certainly in organizations that I've come across lately, they are taking this seriously and are trying to do something about it.
Okay, I think this is a really important question. So are there ways that have been identified in the panelists' work that show us ways to sensitively identify older LGBTQ+ people more proactively? The invisibility and hiddenness of this population within the community and across different forms of residential and nursing care is a really sad reality, but the challenges of creating safe spaces to identify and then better support these people seem really big.
Yeah,
I think it's a really key question, isn't it? I know it's something that my research looked at, and the providers that took part in my research were really keen to have these conversations, really keen to ask the right questions, but didn't feel confident in the skills that they've got to be able to have those inclusive conversations. And some of this, I guess, comes back to training, but also it comes just back to some of the other things that we've talked about around basic cultural competence, person-centered approaches. But yeah, I'd be interested to hear what the panelists kind of have to add to that.
It sort of links together, I think, with having other signs of safety. So if someone asks you the question, what's your sexuality, which is a very sort of explicit question, isn't it? Then maybe you're more likely to answer it if there are other indicators in the environment that whatever your answer is going to be, you will be treated well. But in the work I'm doing in Circle we're designing a resource for residential care specifically, and we're doing that together with care home managers and older LGBTQ+ people. And when we've spoken about this topic, I think what sort of was found would work the best way is approaching it as a conversation in general around personal preferences. So talk about, like, tell me what is important for you, and then you can think about who is most important person in your life. We can talk about things like pronouns or sexuality, and then if it's sort of part of a broader conversation about the things that are important to you, then it's maybe less sort of shocking to just straightforwardly ask, hey, what's your sexuality? And then people for whom that feels less important, then they don't have to pick up on it. But I think it's sort of approaching it in multiple ways. And yeah, like the question, who are important in your life, because we often hear stories around people's partners not being taken as seriously as heterosexual partners. So, but also realizing that I think as a provider, you have the responsibility of giving people the chance to disclose, but also realizing that people have the right to not disclose. You don't have to disclose your sexuality, and maybe for some people it will take a bit longer. They may need to spend some time there and feel like, oh, I can be safe here to talk about that this person who visits me all the time is actually not my friend but my partner. Yeah, that's my thoughts.
I think I've heard providers recently talk about. I heard 2 examples recently, because I've been talking to a lot. I've talked to 28 providers recently in some research I've been doing, and I heard examples of a 88-year-old man coming out for the first time living in a care home. I mean, that's such a it's such a significant event, you know, for somebody that age. And then a woman who formed a relationship with she like everyone thought she was heterosexual, including her family, forming a relationship with another woman in a care home. And she had early dementia, early cognitive issues, which, you know, caused a lot of ethical issues for staff and everything. But the upshot of it was she was so happy. She was happy. And that was the main observation. She'd been a bit miserable from what I gather in the later years, and she was very happy. So I think this kind of very person-centered, really following the person, their wishes, and just being aware that, you know, as older people, I say as old because I'm nearly 65, but as older people, we are always growing and learning and changing and adapting to our environments. And I think it's about not stereotyping older people. That's the baseline. And people with diverse identities, what the race, sexual, gender identities, but allowing people to emerge and be themselves, you know, self-determination, and everything that you do in relation to when you're interacting in a care setting, either through access, you know, people who have been living with you in an environment which can't be easy. And it's also about the relationships with other residents or other people using services. It's about always being open to how that person wants is their potential and their and recognizing their journey. So I think these are kind of very strong principles that I always adopt when I'm thinking about care, how we care for people.
I mean, the story that sticks in my mind is a gay man that I spoke to who was in a care home, and the care home used to run sort of reminiscent groups. And the particular reminiscent group that really upset him was that all the residents were asked to bring photographs of their wedding, and to have a group to talk about what they remember about that occasion and what was special about it. And he felt really excluded because, as a gay man, who grew up at a time when it was illegal. He never got married, so prior to going into the care home, he lived alone. So I asked him, so what did you do? And he said, well, I didn't go to it. Obviously, I hid in my room. And I said, and what happened after that? Did the staff come and talk to you and ask you why you didn't attend or anything? And he said, it just went unnoticed. Oh, so-and-so didn't attend that group. And so I think it's like to what's been said all along, really, is that treat people as individuals and treat them with respect and dignity, and to keep an open mind, really.
Thank you. Okay, we've time to fit in a couple more questions, I think. Diamond, I am going to come to the AI questions, but I'm just going to ask this one first. So we have a message which I think will have gone into the Q&A, so people will be able to see the link that the attendees put in for the website for AWOC. So AWOC is Aging Without Children, and one of the people who's involved in running that, and also Free to Be Me in Care, which is a training package that's delivered within care homes. And that person's asked, how can we take into account our folk who are aging without the support of children or family?
Sorry, Liz, could you repeat that?
Yeah, sorry. How can we take into account our folk who are aging without the support of children or family?
Yeah. Can I start with this one? Because I've got recent experience of this. One of the things that keeps coming up all the time in various studies for me is that the lack of planning that people have as they're aging. So the people that I've been talking to through research, if you ask them a question of like, have you made any plans for as you get older, the answer will often be no. So even though they live alone, they don't have children. A lot of their friends have died. They got very poor social networks, and they are quite socially isolated or whatever. They do not make any arrangements for what would happen to them if they got to a state where they needed social care. So so we've been tackling this, and a colleague of mine called Claire Truscott had been running a series of workshops in Lambeth. And I was really surprised, because there's a lot of legal implications for things, like making a will. There's having a power of attorney, appointing a power of attorney. And I was surprised with the people who attended these sessions, how little that they knew, basically, about any of these things, and how little, so when I said to people, what are you afraid of about growing older? And these are older people, but, as they go into their 80s and 90s, perhaps. And the main thing is dementia. And the second thing is not having anyone to look after me. Or the third thing is always going into a care home. People are really frightened of going into a care home. And it's a sort of, they're probably people who will not have the benefit of being able to afford care themselves. So they will probably go into statutory care services, I should think. So I would say to people, and I've thought about this for a while, it's a bit like there's a real need for a book or something that helps people navigate the social care system as they, LGBT people, as they grow older. This is how you navigate the social care system, basically.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of work going on around care navigation. So it's certainly in terms of the research world. So, but you're right, it's absolutely key, isn't it?
Yeah. And I would say to people, please, don't leave it to fate. Try and make some, I know you can't plan for everything, but try and make some plans so that, at least you'll have some choice as you grow older, where you're looked after and who looks after you.
Okay, I'm going to just read a question from my screen over here. So apologies if I'm looking in the wrong direction. This was a question that was sent in by an attendee. I read a recent article in Unison about AI and how it will affect future care needs. It said that when asked what workers of the future would look like, it came up with men wearing ties. There was absolutely nothing on LGBTQIA people or disabilities. In light of this, can you discuss how policymakers and researchers such as yourselves can address this AI or artificial discrimination for care needs for ageing LGBTQIA people now and of the future to be protected from this artificial unintelligence?
Brilliant question.
Brilliant question.
Yeah. Shall I start? I mean, I think
Please, yeah.
there is evidence in social care services about how discriminatory AI applications can be, and it's maybe an aspect of the way that they make decisions. Really, they search the internet for what they're looking for, themes and norms, and they're not norms in society, they're norms in terms of how things are described. So it's not necessarily surprising that they're coming up with these very narrow depictions. And how do we write diversity into that is a really important question, because we're doing that in social care and in higher education too. I see that people are trying to use AI in a way that gets around this discriminatory, racist, and sexist these risks that come with it. But actually, the diversity can often be really superficial. So that there's still the images that AI generates are intended to look beautiful. They might look ethnically diverse, but they also look quite white, and they look very heterosexual. So that's about what's written into the software to generate beauty. So I think we've got to be really, really careful about how we use AI in social care, because it is going to be used more and more. Yeah, there's real risks attached to that.
Anybody got any other thoughts on AI and how we diversify AI?
Yeah, no, my own, you know, we are beginning to look at research around AI, but it's mainly health services, not social care. But I would say that it's just LGBTQ. I would doubt very much if it's on people's agenda, unfortunately. You know, and that's what we have to change. I am now definitely, because a lot of AI organizations have been in touch with me, I am now going to contact them. I've already mentioned it, obviously, but this is definitely something I'm going to take away from today.
There must be an opportunity in there. There must be an opportunity in there somewhere. That's what we got to think. I don't know what the opportunity is, but it sounds like you've got it, Ben, because you've got an invitation. So the opportunity as well as, you know.
Yeah.
I wonder if there's a timeliness about it that, like you're saying, Diamond, those things are moving on and they're starting to think about, you know, and I think there is a bit of kickback, isn't there, also about AI more generally, and how that's not reality, and we're not sure if that's actually what we want, but can we get in there? Can we get at those tables now and be having those conversations as this is developing, and before the government or providers take steps to be re-providing services in those ways, using some of those mechanisms to actually kind of, you know, not necessarily just about LGBT, but, you know, broader cultural competence, and how, you know, there's lots of evidence to show that if somebody doesn't feel a familiarity or comfort with the person that they're interacting with, that they're less likely to receive care, to, you know, that they're more likely to kind of resist that there's all sorts of cultural reasons why people put off you know, accessing care in the first place, and it's, you know, it's our opportunity, I guess, isn't it, to get in at the beginning or ish of those kind of developments and say, actually, this stuff is really important and will make a massive impact, because I think it comes back to, often we don't think about what's the actual impact on people of these things. We don't make that longer term connection. So yeah, I think it can be potentially really positive, but we need to make sure that we're shaping it, I guess, in that right way. I'm very conscious of time. We've got a couple of minutes left. I know that I'm going to bring up a slide which has got some links on it. As I mentioned at the beginning, we will send an email out with all these links in, but I wanted to put them up on the screen. But also I'm going to hand over to Ben, because I think Ben's going to do a bit of an announcement about something that he's got coming up as well. So while Ben is talking, I'll share the screen again with the last slide, and then I'll come in at the end to thank everybody.
Thank you, Liz, and thank you for inviting me today. I just want to alert people that I'm working with a fabulous group of people with a community trust in London, and we are running an event on the 1st of March at the Queer Britain Museum. And what it's a listening event, and it's for people who are LGBTQ+ with dementia and their carers. So if you know anyone who fits that description and they'd like to attend, that would be excellent. If you want to attend yourself because you're interested, that would also be interesting. Very welcome. So somehow, I don't know, I think Liz is going to send stuff out later. I will let Liz know the details, but you'll find it on lots of websites. There's a flyer saying the timing and where it's being held. Thanks very much for that.
Brilliant, thank you. So I'm just going to end by saying a massive thank you to our panelists for their time, their wisdom, to all the attendees for coming along today, to Chris from the University of York EDI team for making all the magic happen, and we wouldn't be here without him. So thank you, and it's great that we've been able to facilitate such an important session as part of LGBT History Month. As I said, we will send out an email with the recording with all the links to the session that Ben's talked about, to Jolie's Circle project and other things that the panelists are involved in, as well as, very importantly, the link to the learning framework. And yeah, just to say thank you so much for everyone coming along today. We really appreciate it, and happy LGBT History Month.
And thank you, Liz, for taking initiative. Well done.
Yeah. Bye, everyone.